Monitoring Exchange Server 2003. Monitoring Exchange is a key component in ensuring that your Exchange servers are running at their maximum performance. When considering a monitoring plan for Exchange, we need to consider the following essential services. Firstly, checking the Windows event logs, particularly the application log, yields a lot of information about your Exchange server. Exchange regularly writes information to the event log about the service failures or if a disk is running out of space. Next, monitoring Windows services is a good idea because a good service monitoring program can indicate to an administrator that a service is having problems or has stopped unexpectedly, and this can give you a head start on fixing the problem before angry users start beating on your door. Now, network performance is crucial to Exchange because if your network is slow, then Exchange is slow. You can use Network Monitor to capture and analyze network traffic coming to and from your Exchange server. Network Monitor is great because you can use it to identify users that are making a lot of requests to your Exchange server, as well as users that are unauthorized and attempting to gain access. Now, the server performance of your Exchange server is an obvious thing to monitor because if the underlying operating system is performing poorly, then there's little you can do to make Exchange run well. Using utilities like the Task Manager on your server, or even moving to the Windows System Resource Manager if you are running the Enterprise Edition of Windows Server 2003, it can be a great idea so you can proactively manage and monitor your processes. Next, if you're running your back-end Exchange servers in a cluster, then monitoring the cluster resources such as the virtual memory counters, and of course then monitoring for failovers. And finally, we should monitor the Exchange server's store statistics to monitor disk space and users that are hogging system resources. Monitoring the Exchange store lets you know when the store was last accessed, and having this information available can be useful, especially if you want to remove a store and you need to justify your reasons for doing this to management. Now, Microsoft provide a tool to monitor many of the typical things you should be monitoring on your Exchange server. So in our System Manager, we'll expand Tools, Monitoring and Status, and then we'll click on Status, and over here on the right, we'll right-click on our server and we'll select Properties. Now, this Monitoring and Status utility does monitor the key Exchange system services by default. Now, you can use it to monitor other services that aren't even Exchange services if you like, and this can be a good idea because let's say that we're running an antivirus program on this back-end Exchange server, well, we could use this tool to monitor that service as well. Now, here we can see we have one default entry, and that's for the default Microsoft Exchange services. On the right, under Critical State column, we can see that it says stopped. Now, this doesn't mean that our services are stopped. This means that we want to monitor these services, and if the status is stopped, then we have a critical event. So if we click on this link over here on the left, we can see that these default services actually include 6 services, including the web service. Now, if we wanted to add another service in here, we could simply click on Add, and then we could select a service from the available list. Although in my opinion it would be better to add our own custom list to the front window, especially if those services weren't key to our Exchange server but were more geared to the operating system. So let's say we want to add a threshold for a certain amount of disk space on this system. What we'll do is we'll click on Add, and you can see here that we've got quite a few options. We've got available virtual memory, our CPU utilization, of course our disk space, our SMTP queue growth, a Windows 2000 service, and that's what the default option we looked at a moment ago uses, so you've already seen that. And finally, we've got the X400 queue growth. So we'll select free disk space, and then we'll click on OK. And now here under the drive to be monitored, we can simply select our disk that we want to monitor. Now in our case, we only have the one drive, but you'd see all of your drives listed here. Then we'll check on the warning state box, and here we're going to enter in a value of 1024 megabytes. And in our critical state box, we'll enter in a value of 512 megabytes. And now we'll click on OK. Alright, well what we've done now is set up monitoring because if our C drive's disk space drops below 1 gig, then we'll get a warning. And if it drops below 512 meg, then a critical alert is raised. Now down to the bottom here, we could disable all monitoring of this server if we wish, but unless you've got another application such as say Tivoli monitoring, actively reporting the health of your servers, I'd suggest leaving this running. So we'll click on OK, and now our monitoring will take effect. Now on our notifications folder here, This is where we'd see any alerts that were triggered as a result of our monitoring reaching one of the values that we just said earlier. Okay, so the next thing we can monitor is the Exchange queues. So we'll expand our administrative groups, and then our New York administrative group, and finally we'll expand servers, and then our server, and here we can see queues. So if we select queues, in the right hand side, we can see we can use our queue viewer to administer SMTP virtual server queues, the MTA queues, any of our connector queues, DNS submissions, failed messages, and of course messages that have been deferred for later delivery. There are quite a few options here. Now up the top here we can choose to disable outbound mail. Now you'll probably find a time in your Exchange career where you'll use this option. Now as you'd expect, this button disables all outgoing SMTP mail. And this could be a good option to choose, for example, if say a virus is found to be infecting your network and outbound messages are sent containing the infected email. But disabling this outbound email doesn't affect your MTA or your system queues. But if you don't want to disable all outbound email, yet you wish to disable one of these single queues, let's say for example you want to disable our local delivery queue, you could simply right click on the queue and then select to freeze the queue. Now over here on the right we'll see the state has changed to frozen. To unfreeze it, we'd simply right click again and then choose unfreeze. Now the other option we had on our right click menu here was to force a connection, and this is used when you have a large number of messages backed up in the queue and things don't seem to be moving along. Now we could also find messages in our queue, and we have the same option here up the top as well, and here we'd simply enter in the search criteria of a sender or a recipient so we can locate emails that way. Now this is really useful, especially if we have a user who's complaining that they never received an email. We could use this feature to ascertain if the message reached our organization or not. Now down here on the settings button, this allows us to change the refresh interval of our queues, and the default is to refresh this every 2 minutes. Now if we happen to double click on a queue, we can see in greater detail the messages that are in the queue awaiting delivery. Now when we talked about forcing a connection a moment ago, we can also look inside the queue here, and if it happens to be a large message that seems to be holding up delivery of your emails, then you can delete the email from here. Okay, the next thing we should look at now is diagnostic logging. To get to the diagnostic logging, what we'll do is we'll right click on our server and we'll select properties. And now we'll come up to the top here and choose the Diagnostics Logging tab. Alright, now on the left hand side here we can see a whole bunch of services. If we select one, on the right hand side we can see a list of categories that relate to the service. So for example here we've selected the Exchange MTA, and on the right we can see all of the categories that apply to the MTA. Now over here under the logging level column you can see currently that all of these categories are set to none. So if we wanted to change that, we could simply highlight a category, and then down the bottom here we could choose a logging level of minimum, medium or maximum. Now whilst this diagnostic logging is very useful, especially to assist us in troubleshooting problems with our Exchange server, it does write a whole bunch of events to the Windows application log. So if you are planning to use these, be prepared to either increase the maximum size of your event logs or to have to clear it on a regular basis. Okay, so let's move on, and no mention of monitoring on a Windows server would be complete without a discussion of the Performance Console. So let's fire it up. We'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then we'll choose Performance. Now I'd expect that most of you are probably very familiar with this tool, so we'll get straight into it, and we'll come over here on the left and we'll expand our Performance Logs and Alerts, and then we'll right click on Counter Logs and we'll select New Log Settings. Now we need to give our new log a name, and we'll just call this one Server01 Exchange so we can identify what it is, and we'll choose OK. Now this will bring up the properties for our new performance log. Now at the top here on the General tab you can see the name of the log file and the location where it's going to be stored. So the first thing we need to do is add a counter. So we'll come down here and we'll click on Add Counters. Now at the top of our Add Counter window we have the option to use the local computer counters or to use counters from a specific computer. Now it defaults to the local computer anyway, but if we wanted to use a different machine we just enter in the name of the machine here. Okay, so the first thing we'll need to do is add in a performance object for CPU utilization. So in this drop down box here we'll leave the default, which is set to processor, and down the bottom here we can see it's also set to percentage processor time. Now on the right It also defaults to the total processor time for CPU number 0. Now we only have the one CPU in our box, so that's all we see, but if we were running a multiple CPU box, we'd see 1, 2, 3 and so on. Alright, so we'll click on add, and then we'll quickly go and add in a few more objects. So under our performance object drop down box, this time we'll choose a process, and we'll leave our default counter, and in our instances column we'll scroll down and we'll select our information store, and then we'll click on add. Okay, so we'll go back up and select our performance object, and we'll scroll up to the top here, and we can see quite a few Microsoft Exchange specific counters. So what we'll do is we'll choose the MS Exchange information store, and down here under our counters we'll choose the RPC operations per sec, and we'll choose add, and we'll also choose our RPC requests and choose add as well. Now next we'll go back up here again and we'll choose our Exchange IS Mailbox option, and from our counters list we'll select our local delivery rate, and then we'll choose add. And now we'll just add in a few more counters for disk and memory as well. So again we'll come back up the top here, we'll choose our physical disk, and we'll scroll down and we'll choose our disk transfers per second, we'll choose add, and again we'll come back up here and this time we'll choose our memory, and we'll leave the default which is pages per second, and we'll choose add. Okay, now finally we'll add in one more. We'll choose the SMTP server, and then down the bottom here we'll choose the local queue length, and we'll choose add, and now we'll choose close. Now under our counters window we can see all the counters we've added, and there's quite a few here. Okay, now we can see that our sampling interval's been set for every 15 seconds, but for our purposes I'm going to set this a little shorter to say 5 seconds so we can see some action. So now we'll just click on OK, and we'll get a message telling us that our directory we're going to save our performance logs in doesn't exist, and that's because this is our first log that we've configured on this server, so we'll say yes to get it to create it for us. And now if we go and click on counter logs, we can see over here that our Server 01 Exchange log we created a moment ago is running as indicated by the green little disk platter icon that you see on the left hand side here. Now once you've captured enough data to produce a good sample of what your server's up to, it's time to analyze your data. So we'll right click on our performance counter, and then we'll choose to stop the counter from collecting more data. Okay, it's changed to red now, indicating that our data collection has stopped. So now what we'll do is we'll come over here and we'll select our system monitor, and then over here on the right we'll choose this little grey database looking icon to view the log data. Now this opens up a new window, and here we'll need to provide the name of our log file. So down here we'll select log files, and then we'll choose add. Now here we can see the name of the log file that we've just created, so we'll select that and we'll choose open. And now we need to come up here and select the data tab, and then we have to add in the performance counters that we added into our original performance log that we created. Now we already have a couple listed here. We have the memory, disk and processor. So what we'll do is we'll select add, and then under our performance object you can see the objects that we added into our original performance monitor here. So we don't need to add in memory, you've already done that. So we'll select the MS Exchange IS, and then we'll choose the RPC operations, and we'll choose add, the RPC requests, and we'll choose add. And then we'll go up here to the next one, which was our mailbox, and it already defaults to our local delivery rate, so we can simply just choose add again. And we'll come down and select our process and choose add, and of course our SMTP server. And now we can click on close, and then we can see all of the counters here in the available list. Okay, so now we can click OK, and here we can see that our graph changes to display the data that we've collected. Now obviously this is only a very small amount of data that we've just collected, so it really doesn't tell us too much about our server. But in your environment, running counters like this during the morning when people log on, or when your server's being backed up, or perhaps when you feel your Exchange server is the busiest, this will give you some really good data and possibly justification for asking the boss for that new whiz-bang server that you're after. Now if we click on the report icon, we can get a text-based report on what the status of our server was over the monitored period. Okay, that's performance monitoring. Now the next thing we should mention about monitoring is protocol logging. Now protocol logging is configured in the Exchange System Manager. So what we'll do is we'll navigate over to our Server 01 in our New York Administrative Group, and then we'll expand Protocols, and we'll expand our SMTP folder. Now underneath our SMTP folder we have a default SMTP virtual server, so we'll right click on that and we'll select Properties. Now at the bottom here you can see we have an option to enable logging. Now, if you're familiar with IIS, then you'd probably be familiar with these different logging options. Now, we'll just leave the default logging option, which is the W3C extended log file format, and if we choose properties, we could also set a schedule on how often we want to create a new log file. Now, the default is to create a new log file every single day. Now, down the bottom here you can see the location in which our log files will be stored, and at the bottom we can see the format of our log files. So our log files will be saved in the SMTP Service 1 directory of this path, and then our log files will have the name of EX followed by the year, the month and the date, and of course ending in the .log extension. Now, if we choose the Advanced tab, we can configure any extended logging options that we want, such as a client's IP address or the username and so on and so forth. So if you're planning on using protocol logging, you're going to see a lot of information in this directory here about who's connecting to your server and what they've been doing. Okay, now the final thing I want to talk about with regards to logging and monitoring our Exchange server is simply going to our Mailbox store and then clicking on Mailboxes. So over here under our first storage group, we'll expand that. We can see our Mailbox store. We'll expand that as well. And we'll just expand this to make it a bit easier to see. And here we can see we do have a Mailboxes folder. So if we click on that there, in the right hand side, we can see the mailboxes that we have within this Mailbox store. Now we could simply click on the size column up here. And this of course will give us the ability to sort our list in either descending or ascending order depending on which way the arrow is pointing. But that'll give you a visual cue on who's using up the most amount of space on our Exchange server, and of course in the next column we can also see the total items. Now the last log on time column can also give us a visual clue as to whether or not the mailbox is being used, or perhaps the person's left the company and no one's bothered to tell us, so that could be used to remind you to remove any unused mailboxes. Okay, there you have monitoring Exchange. It's not a terribly difficult thing to do, and the tools are there. They just require a little bit of configuration. So knowing exactly how your Exchange server performs really helps you in building a fast, reliable server, and you can use these tools and techniques discussed in this video to maximize your Exchange server's potential.